Mexico City is lovely too.
Yeah,
You've been,
just once, but I loved it. Yeah, yeah,
it's an amazing place.
yeah.
I can get enough of it. We're lucky to be there. Last year, I was there with the full grade,
Uh-huh.
and children went to school.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Um, just felt, Mexican for a while.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
But I really miss New York. And
Yeah.
we were gone for.
Good evening.
Uh-huh.
Good evening, everybody. Uh, Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Novia Pagone. I'm the interim director of the Center for Community Media and an assistant professor of Spanish language and literatures and global studies. Thank you for joining us for the official launch of the Center for Community Media here at Governor State University. We're thrilled to have with us tonight special guests Moustafa Bayoumi and Oswaldo Zavala. You have many fans already. And we're proud to present a program that represents the kind of dialogue that the CCM aims to facilitate on our campus and in our communities. To kick off the evening, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the president of Governor State University, Dr. Cheryl Green.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Pagnoni. It is my privilege and my honor to welcome you to Governor State University and also to all of the Jaguars in the audience. I'm excited to celebrate the launch of the Community Media Center at Governor State University. This has been a long time coming, but much awaited with great anticipation. A lot has been written about, and all of us know from our own personal and professional experience, the power of media in our lives and in our world. Mass media, independent media, social media, and media technology permeate an ever-growing scope of our existence and bring with it access to astonishing amounts of information, the ability to make previously unthinkable connections, and the power to reach and influence, negatively or positively, unprecedented amounts of people. It's fair to say today that media shapes our world. However, it is no secret that not everyone has equal access to quality media and its world-shaping power. It is no surprise that old biases around income, religion, race, and countless other dehumanizing prejudices stifle and suppress the promise of new media for hundreds of thousands of citizens. And while in America we have the constitutional right to the freedom of speech, systemic injustices all too often prevent our fellow Americans from contributing their knowledge, their wisdom, their voice to the conversations that shape our lives and are broadcast through the media. Governor State University has a long history and a deep commitment to working alongside, empowering, and giving voice to students who have been underserved by cultural and political biases and unjust systems. At GSU, we aspire to represent and embrace students who are increasingly changing the demographic profile of the 21st century college student. Their experience, their characteristics include things like older adults, working full or part-time, seeking social mobility, first generation, ethnically diverse, rural, and all of them full of academic, professional, and civic potential. Furthermore, as the jewel of the Southland, we are so very proud to be a world-class institution, a leader in education and innovation with a strong and enduring commitment to being a model of inclusive excellence in a region often overlooked by government agencies and corporate enterprises. The Center for Community Media is a shining and best example of what it means to be the jewel of the region. We are not the isolated ivory tower of academia. This is the faculty, staff, and students at Governor State University putting their world-class knowledge and skills to work for the benefit of the campus, the Southland, and beyond. The Center for Community Media is a direct outflow of GSU's vision of stimulating the public square and promoting the quality of life for our campus community and Chicago's Southland region, that, as we have noted, has long been neglected by many media sources. Governor State University is here, and we are preparing students with the knowledge, skills, and confidence to succeed in a global society, as is prescribed in our mission statement. Our faculty and staff are leaders in their fields, experts in training students, and committed to building a more just and equitable world. Our students are bright, resilient, eager to learn and grow, and they have something to say, something that needs to be heard. We will help uplift their voices and spread their message to the world. I will close by extending an enthusiastic congratulations to Dr. Debbie James, Dr. Novia Pagnoni, the CCM Steering Committee, and the Board of Directors who advise the center, and to all of you who brought us to this precipitous moment. We are excited to see and hear the Center for Community Media use the power of media to meet needs in our community, connect diverse people, and amplify the voices of those who are unseen and unheard, but oh, so deserving. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green, for those powerful and important words. Now it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium the Provost of Governor State University, Dr. Beverly Schneller.
We are so pleased and honored to be here this evening to be joined by our two distinguished guests, and we're excited to hear from them. I'm standing between you and the round table that you came for, and I want to thank our events organizers and Dr. Radovic-Fanta for serving as moderator for the upcoming round table as well. As a student of 18th century British literature and the British press for my own PhD work, I have a special place in my heart for the relationship that we have in the United States between freedom of the press and the existence of the media, the fourth estate itself. It is impressive to see how the media has changed and survived from what, at least in Britain, were originally collections of secondhand stories called news books that came from Holland, Dutch courantos, how those evolved into newspapers, how the editorial page evolved in the 1750s in London, because before that it was just stories that people told and said, they weren't even there, and so they would just tell stories about things they thought should have happened. How newspapers were posted in America in town centers and squares. People learned to read by reading journalism, right? They were read to, and they learned to read by reading journalism. And then, of course, we have the now not so common anymore home subscriptions to newspapers that moved from outside to inside with the news. And then, as Dr. Green mentioned, we have social media and we have public access broadcasting. The very origin of the word itself, publish, means to make available to the public the world of ideas. With our own laws here in the US against censorship and our ability to protect speech in word, video, print, art, we enjoy the opportunity through mass media and through our communities to exchange ideas and realize in so doing the influence and impact that the media has in shaping our understanding and knowledge of events and experiences, as well as creating impact and valuation of ideas within a culture. To say that the media has an influence on our lives, no matter what the medium, is really an understatement of the enduring power of the press and of the creators of the news and creators of media who shape and define culture, behavior, and ultimately what we come to see as truth. Consistent with the tenets of freedom of the press, our own Center for Community Media has embraced a particular public service mission through broadcast. As a result of the CCM, students, faculty, and the community will be able to engage with compelling stories that connect people around and on issues of local and global value. In giving voice to the realities of lived experiences, inequities, prejudices, accomplishments, perceptions, and in challenging these through mass media, through community-based media, we should be aware that were it not for the relationship of the leadership of writers and journalists, among whom we have exemplars tonight, we would be sorely deprived of the kind of intellectual stimulation and self-reflection that defines higher education and makes us stronger citizens active in the public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schneller. Dr. Green and Dr. Schneller, thank you for being here and for your support and your leadership. It's very important. I want to say just a couple of words. Mostly you've heard about the mission of the center, you've heard about the mission of the university, you've heard about our dedication to social justice. And I want to, instead of talking about the center's mission, because you've already heard about it, I want to invite students to get involved. Come and find us. You can tell your stories. We want you to tell your stories. I want to invite faculty to get involved with the Media Research Institute so you can talk about your research publicly, have the support to do that, and invite faculty to come and be a part of media across the curriculum, which allows you to support students to tell their stories in a particular way through work in the classroom. And that's a journey that we began a few years ago. And tonight we continue on that journey, right, sort of officially. Before I introduce our speakers and moderator, I have a few people to thank, as you can imagine. So this kind of endeavor requires a mighty team of talented individuals. I would like to thank those people. To the Center's advisory board members, thank you for giving your time and expertise in support of the Center's mission. It means the world to us and to all of us here and our students in the campus. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences Interim Dean Jason Zingsheim for his ongoing support and leadership. The center would not exist without the vision and tremendous work of Dr. Debbie James. Yes. who's now the interim division chair of the Division of Arts and Letters. She's the founder and former chair of the CCM, and has entrusted me to continue that work, and I'm very honored. I'm very honored. Huge thank you to the CCM steering committee members who have brought diverse points of view and knowledge to building the CCM. May we continue in that manner. I also want to thank the GSU Foundation for its support. And finally, there are not enough words to properly thank the event committee who put together today's celebration. John Z. Macaulay Davis, Rhonda Jackson, and Gretchen Jankowski. And all the students who came to our call. You all have my eternal gratitude and appreciation, truly. It seems like it might be too much, but this is a big event with a lot of moving parts, and without you, it would not be here. So now it is my honor to introduce our guest and moderator, if you would like to come to the stage. Mustafa Bayoumi is the author of the critically acclaimed How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America, which won an American Book Award and the Arab American Book Award for nonfiction. Some of you are holding that book tonight. Some of you are reading it for class, and some of you will win one later. The book has also been translated into Arabic by Arab scientific publishers. His latest book, This Muslim American Life, Dispatches from the War on Terror, from NYU Press, was chosen as a best book of 2015 by the Progressive magazine and was also awarded the Arab American Book Award for nonfiction. And there are a lot of accomplishments here. You might want to hold on to your applause. An accomplished journalist, Dr. Bayoumi is also a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Daily Beast, The Nation, CNN.com, the London Review of Books, The National, the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Progressive, and other places. Dr. Bayoumi is professor of English at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and is the recipient of 2 Excellence in Teaching Awards. He also received a 2011 Culture and Achievement Award from the Network of Arab American Professionals and the 2016 Pathmaker to Peace Award from the organization Brooklyn for Peace. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Oswaldo Zavala is a journalist and professor of contemporary Latin American literature and culture with a joint appointment at the College of Staten Island and at the Graduate Center, which are both institutions of the City University of New York. He is the author of Drug Cartels Do Not Exist, Narcotrafficking and Culture in the US and Mexico, which was published this year by Vanderbilt, which some of you will have a chance to win later. It was translated from the original Spanish, Los Carteles No Existen, Narcotráfico y Cultura en México. And I'm going to have a bunch of things to read in Spanish, and I'm not going to translate them, but if you want to know what they are, you can ask me later. His latest book, La Guerra en las Palabras, Una Historia Intelectual del Narco en México, 1975 to 2020, was published by Debate earlier this year. Dr. Zavala has written and co-edited several books, including La Modernidad Insufrible, Roberto Bolaño en los Límites de la Literatura Latinoamericana Contemporánea, Volver a la Modernidad, Genealogías de la Literatura Mexicana de Fin de Siglo, and Tiranas Ficciones Poética y Política de la Escritura en la obra de Horacio Castellanos Moya, which was co-authored with Magdalena Perkowska. Dr. Zavala's more than 50 published academic articles explore a variety of topics, including contemporary Mexican narrative, the construction of nationalist imaginaries, and the representation and conceptualization of the border between Mexico and the United States. His work has been featured in national and international publications such as The Nation, Los Angeles Times, El País, and Proceso. Welcome, Dr. Zavala. Thank you both for being here and for sharing your work and perspectives with us. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Jelena Radovic-Fanta, who you may recognize. Dr. Radovic-Fanta is a cultural anthropologist, educator, and ethnographic researcher. She has a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Riverside. She is currently an associate professor of anthropology and sociology here at GSU, and affiliate faculty in the Global Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies programs. Dr. Radovic-Fanta's research examines labor and gender with Chilean grape workers and racial formation in the country. She also investigates belonging and identity among first-generation college students. Dr. Radovic-Fanta has published in journals of anthropology, Latin American studies, and higher education, and has been recipient of an AAUW research publication grant and co-PI, I'm proud to say with me, of an undergraduate international studies and foreign language grant. Thank you, Jelena, for your work. And I have just a couple more words of housekeeping before I hand it over. So there will be time for audience questions at the end. If you have a question at that time, we have microphones on either side of the room. Please be sure to step up to the microphone so that your question can be heard by everyone here and those joining us online. I also ask that you please silence or turn off your cell phone and other devices at this time if you have not already. We are live streaming this event and recording it. Thank you again for being here tonight, and enjoy the evening.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. How are we all doing? Good. All right. Novia, Dr. Pagone, thank you for the introductions. President Green and Provost Schneller, thank you for your words. Audience members, those who are here in person and joining us virtually, welcome to the conversation on democracy, inclusion, and the media. I also want to acknowledge everyone who has worked very hard in not only organizing this event, but giving birth to the Center for Community Media. A lot of hard work put in there. And finally, last but not least, welcome, bienvenidos to our special guests, Mustafa Bayoumi and Oswaldo Zavala. So we're very excited to have you here. And so let's get started. If you can tell us, what has led you to where you are currently in your professional lives? Why are you doing the work that you do? Who wants to go first?
You want to begin?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Governor State University, a woman-led institution. That's fantastic. Very happy to see that. Thank you also to the Center for Community Media for the invitation to come and talk to you, and for everybody who's organized this wonderful event. I can't tell you how important it is and how incredible it is to start new centers and new institutes in these times that we are in, and especially one that is so central to the mission of not just the public university, but the greater public good in a democratic society. So I want to just offer my congratulations to you all. Now, back to your question. So what got me here besides the late plane that I arrived on? So that's a good question. You know, I mean, I started off actually, my first area of study was architecture. I come from a family of scientists. I come from a family of scientists, Egyptian immigrants. You know, my mother and father are PhDs, my mother in chemistry, my father in engineering. My brother and sister went into medical school. You know, I'm the youngest. They would come up to me and say, "What medical school are you going to?" And I would be very resentful, you know. And so I wanted to do something more in the arts field. And so architecture seemed like a happy medium where it was like, so, you know, my parents could accept that at the same time that I could be creative. Well, I didn't last very long in architecture school. And so instead, I just went full-blown into English. And then in English, I started writing for the student newspaper. This is all in Canada, where I was raised in Canada. And, you know, and I also, as somebody who comes from the Middle East, if you know people who come from the Middle East, you know that their households are political households, almost always. And so we learn from when you're like, before you can even walk and talk, you learn a kind of media criticism because your parents are throwing shoes at the TV, right? And they're instructing you on how TV lies and things like that from the very beginning. And so it was, I think the notion of participating in the world of journalism from a critical angle was always something that I thought was interesting to me. So I've always kept a foot in scholarship and a foot in journalism. And I've continued doing that throughout my whole career. And then what really, I think, though, pushed it even further was the attacks of 9/11. I was in New York City on 9/11, and I had gone to New York for graduate school. I'd already lived there for a decade or so before the attacks of 9/11. And I was familiar with the community, with all various communities around New York City. And I was very familiar with the ways in which they were, facing a whole lot of vigilante violence, a whole lot of brand new hatreds, and almost completely erased out of the coverage, the media coverage of that event. And so that really just propelled me to start writing more and more and pushing myself more into the journalism world. I think, if anything, that's really what, that's sort of the longer answer, I think, for your question. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Oswaldo?
Well, first of all, I want to join in congratulating the university and the center. It's extraordinary to find this project, especially in these difficult times for academia and for everybody. So I'm honored and excited to be here, and in many ways very jealous and wanting to stay a little longer and perhaps keep on this conversation going as much as I can. And also thank you and Jelena and Mustafa for allowing this encounter with somebody from the sister republic of Brooklyn that it's always difficult to meet, even though we live in the same city apparently. Well, in my case, I don't think it's that dissimilar from your background. I come from the U.S.-Mexico border, from a family of normalistas, that is educators. My parents were both teachers at the elementary and middle school level. So my brother, his wife, his in-laws, his everybody. And I always resisted the label of educator myself, right? And I didn't want to become an educator. I was the rebellious youngest. And I became a journalist when I started college. I worked at the local newspaper in Juarez when I was 19. And I think that marked a journey that I believe still goes on in many respects. I realized that growing at the border did not at all imply this romanticized idea that somehow you flew between two different environments, two different languages and nationalities, but rather it was a place, as has been theorized lately, where some people were able to move and some others weren't. And so movement was allowed, but not for everyone. Along with that, I had to understand gradually that I lived in between a world of representations. My country looked at the north of Mexico as a place of precarity, migration, violence, drugs. And on the U.S. side, El Paso, Texas, had also a different narrative that separated the Southwest as also a place of difficulty and conflict. And so I quickly understood that the part of my defining identity was trapped in between this dispute, this battle of representing who I was supposed to be. And when I became a journalist, especially covering issues of conflict and in particular drug trafficking, I was fortunate to have mentors who immediately allowed me to question those dominant narratives. So one of the first things that happened in the newsroom and that I believe marked me from the start was that I came back with my story of drug traffickers that after an FBI news conference that talked about the Juarez cartel. And I remember the chief of the newsroom telling me, well, we don't use the word cartel here. And for a minute, I was shocked and thought, well, so how am I supposed to name this group? I have no idea how to call them, because this is how official institutions are calling it. And they said, exactly, that's the point. We do not go by the official institution narrative. So how am I supposed to describe them? Well, think about it. What are cartels? I really don't know. And so it started a fascinating journey for me, trying to understand that very question, and to understand just exactly this dispute that was taking place in my hometown that keeps on going, and where I believe in many ways we are fighting about naming our own reality for ourselves. And so I believe that my journey ever since, whether as a journalist or as an academic, has been trying to mediate in that dispute, and to bring about not a different narrative just for the sake of it, but a more truthful one, a more nuanced one that brings me closer to critical questions that are not emanating from the official institutions of either country.
Yeah. Wow, thank you both. We name our own stories, right? Sure. That's very important. Thank you for sharing. So both of you and previous presenters, talkers, alluded to this unique, we're living in a unique social, cultural, political, economic milieu, right? We are still in the middle of a pandemic. We have economic uncertainty. There are large movements that have erupted around racial justice. We have the curtailing of civil and reproductive rights, right? So what does working for democracy look like in today's context and in the work that you do? Mustafa, do you want to?
Sure, okay.
Kick us off?
Sure, send me the easy question. Yeah, I think that, let's take an example of the internet, right? There used to be this idea of techno-utopia, that somehow the internet was going to solve all the problems, and that would just immediately lead to democracy. Globally, it would break out like an epidemic or a pandemic, right? Well, that didn't happen. We know that didn't happen. Just look at where, for example, the Arab world is today. And in fact, I think what we've seen is, in fact, the ways in which the internet and social media are tools, nihilistic tools for authoritarianism globally. And I think that that's true within the very, you can see that happening in many different examples, not least of which, frankly, is also the United States. And you see the ways in which disinformation and the easy dissemination of hatred as well. There was one study that said, for example, that whenever Trump, I'm sorry, I had to be the first one to bring him up. But when he was tweeting, this is during when he was president, when he would tweet something that was an anti-Muslim tweet, that they would correlate with rises in anti-Muslim violence in various places around the world, right? And let alone the whole Cambridge Analytica, stuff about the ways in which our own participation in these social media companies is feeding into ways in which they're trying to figure out who we are, and then direct our energies, avoiding energies and democratic energies in ways that are destructive, really, or manipulated at least. So I think what it really means, and then on the news today, as I'm coming down here, I see on the crawl they're saying that Facebook is going to make a decision about whether they're going to let Donald Trump back onto Facebook. And of course, we're coming up into the election season again, and so we're going to relive this over and over again. So what that tells me is you got to go smaller. You got to get right to the story. You got to go to the community. You got to go to the people. You can't let the vastness of our social media, corporate social media terrain sort of overtake the work that we do. Like, I think there's an organization that I'm closely aligned with in New York It's a journalistic organization that does community journalism as well. It's called Documented NY. And they're just a fabulous organization. They publish work in English, in Spanish, in Haitian Creole, in simplified Chinese. They have language ability because they're seeking out reporters who have multilingual. And at the same time, they also have a very active WhatsApp channel. And they use their WhatsApp channel to deliver information that's useful to immigrant populations in New York about how to get documented, how to find a shelter, and they use that same access to find out what are the real stories that the legacy media are missing. So they're going much smaller. And I think that what we need to do is actually understand the ways in which people's lives are lived and the difficult ways that people's lives are lived that we don't see. That's the mission, I think, that we have. Social media will always cover up all of that stuff. I don't think it can get that sort of specificity. And I think community media has the possibility to do that. They deliberately talk about how they are not what they call extraction media. They call, the big players extract, where editors who sit in big newsrooms are the ones who decide what the stories are. They're like, we don't want that. These editors don't have our life experiences. They don't have the experiences of the people who we are writing about. We, as the journalists, we're much closer to the stories of the people who we're writing about, and they know what the stakes are. And the stakes are from the people's immediate challenges to their lives to the social welfare of our communal life. And I think that's really, that's where we have to really be critical of where media is heading, and instead try to find the truth in the small.
Well, the question for me, it's also a historical one. I was educated as a journalist on the US side of the border while working at a newspaper on the Mexican side. And I used to take pride about the long tradition of not only journalism schools in the US, but also internships, the system of, gradually coming into the newsroom. And I relished those years where as an intern, I was able to cover sophisticated news with 3 editors from the local desk going over my stuff, a style editor, of course, to polish each piece. And I thought that for many reasons, of course, that was a superior form of journalism than the one I had seen in Mexico. And something that happened throughout the 1990s started to complicate that perspective. First, what happened was that Mexico underwent the political process of opening to more democratic elections. And with that, national media underwent an opening itself from being heavily dominated by state institutions and corruption to private enterprise, corporate news media, and in many ways what was understood back then as freer media. And it did in many ways renovate the practice of journalism and made it a little more professional, and trying to emulate US newsrooms. But as decades have gone by, that picture of progress, if you will, or professionalization of the media in Mexico has become more and more complicated in the sense that we also emulated corporate practices with the media, right? Including, of course, the precarity of journalism, sending journalists and reporters in harm's way without very little protections, exposing them to violence without any resources, and worst of all, allowing the younger generations of journalists to be immersed in a political battle for representation of what's supposed to be democratic or non-democratic, what is populist and what is not. And not only domestically, but also influenced by the discussions taking place miles away in the US. So we have now a media that is trapped in between the geopolitical interventions of U.S. corporate media and U.S. politics, along with our own subalternized way of functioning as journalists, thinking that that model is important. And in between that difficulty, the younger generations are not developing the proper skills to become reporters, but are actually, becoming products of this new era of fast news with little reporting, with a lot of opinion pieces, with a lot of violence. And it seems to me that now that we are supposed to be freer and more professional, we are more confused and more alone than ever. And so I don't want to convey just pure pessimism. I feel that there's many different dimensions of Mexican media to celebrate. But I believe that before thinking of going local, right, as many of them do, and I celebrate that impulse, there is a problem about what really is the news supposed to be about, that we have, on one way, inherited from U.S. corporate media on one hand, but also adapted to our own precarity and our own politics. And I do not believe that just local, by being there locally, is the one answer, but rather by reconnecting with just the simplest, oldest tradition of collecting verifiable data and organizing it in a critical way. I think we've lost that, and especially in the era of social networks. And so, the one thing that brings me back to the border, and once I remember those experiences of working on one side or the other, is that I think that our biggest battle is to learn to be reporters again, to become reporters from the start, to assume that we do not know anything, assume that we are out there to collect verifiable data, and not opinions, and not perspectives that are not be able to check or verify. And so I feel that before any structure of journalism can be really deployed, we need to go back to that original premise. And when I teach journalism, and I'm lucky that even though I work at a department of humanities and literature, I am able to teach journalism courses. I think that's the main message that I keep conveying to my students, that at least in my experience, whether local or national, journalists have seemed to lost the way from what is supposed to be the news, and how to get them.
So collecting verifiable data and going to the community, going local. This makes my anthropologist heart happy.
Very ethnographic.
Yes. So let's switch gears a little bit. What are some wins? What are some successes? What's good in journalism today?
That's an easy one.
He should start one.
You
Yeah.
start.
Well, I think what it's really good of this era is what Jacques Rancière, the famous French philosopher, used to say, is that we are able to democratically alter the regimes of sensibility, the distribution of the perception of sensibility, right? The idea of who gets to speak and what things get to be said. I think that's changed dramatically, even from my own life experience. When I was a young reporter, I remember once approaching an AP editor, Associated Press editor, in one of these national journalism conferences, and asking him to, very humbly, to drop the word illegal alien. Because I found it offensive, but not only just because of that, but because it was just not, a precise form of referring to people who came to this country through irregular ways of migration. He dismissed me in 2 seconds, right? And there was not a question. And he smiled with a rather condescending way, and did not entertain the conversation in any possible way, and just quickly left the room. And to my surprise, that same person, many years later, was talking about the need of displacing this type of vocabulary. I don't know what changed his mind, but I believe we are traversing to an era of that, as President Green was saying a minute ago, people who were not allowed, who were not authorized to speak before, are able now to claim that very right, whether it is through social media or because media itself in nature has been changing. And I celebrate that. The one danger that I see, of course, is that just being able to introduce new objects does not mean that we automatically do it in the critical way that we should. And so I believe that as we are seeing that the democratization of the means for communicating, we are seeing also at the same time the reinforcement of old narratives, right, of old prejudice that comes around, even though we do not, or seldom we hear of illegal immigrants, with the exception of Governor Abbott or Governor DeSantis. I had to be. Also.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems to me that even though as we have a deeper care for the language that we use, and we are more conscious of the politics of representation, all narratives are still, around us and prevailing, and they are difficult to be done with. And so as I said before, I believe it's not just the medium, it's not just the democratization of the voices, it's just to remember who we are as journalists, and to go back to that old premise that I insist on defending, right? It's not just who gets to speak and what is to be heard, but how is it that we account for the stories that we're saying, and how is it that we validate the information that we're setting forth?
Thank you. Mustafa, what wins do you have to share with us?
Well, I do think that, though I was sounding the call of alarm around the internet just a minute ago, there is something very, very positive about the fact that we can read news from around the world very easily in a way that we couldn't have before. And that also includes the ways in which people from other parts of the world look at our own society. And I think that's really interesting. For example, I actually do a lot of opinion journalism. Sorry, my friend.
Oh, I do too. I do.
Yeah.
It's got not to confuse them all the time with.
Yeah, I mean, I write regularly for The Guardian as a columnist, and so the English journalistic tradition is much more opinionated. It's much more slanted towards a tendency, anyways, than American notions of objectivity, which comes with a whole, questionable idea of objectivity at the same time.
Pretense of objectivity.
Yeah. So, but I think that's actually something that is really interesting, just to see how other places look at the same question. And I think that we can then also start to make connections globally in ways that maybe we hadn't been able to as easily before. And that there's a lot of potential, liberatory potential in that very prospect. Sometimes it's even in the world of kind of like guerrilla art, for example, right? Like, to use one example, there was, I don't know if people watch that show Homeland, right? I see a lot of nodding face masks, yes. And so I'll tell you that from, the communities that I'm associated with, we're not big fans of that show, okay? And so there was this one season where much of it was supposed to be taking place in the alleyways of Beirut, which was filmed actually in Berlin, right? And so they had to they contracted an street artist, Lebanese woman, to do graffiti that was going to look like as if it was in Beirut. And in the graffiti, it was all in Arabic, but she was writing things like, "Homeland is racist." And the producers had no idea. And then it goes broadcast globally. And of course, we all had a great laugh at this. That's a win. I think that's actually a win.
Well, I would counter an example to that, that I think, because that I think will make it a nice conversation. The other show that I guess it's our equivalent of Homeland is the series that Netflix put out there called Narcos, right? Which I think it's now in its 7th season or something. And there is two problems first. One, that Spanish is not at all that foreign language in this country anymore. And so producers who would have caught that, right? If we had somehow been that smart to slide that kind of protest note. But the tragic part of this is that then the show itself was produced, cast, written with a lot of Mexican help. And not only, I'm not just saying just Mexican in general, but actually some of our best filmmakers, actors nationally, who themselves supposed to have very political critiques of drug trafficking and representation and racism. And so something that I find shocking is, first, how is it that our creative class collectively have become accomplices in perpetuating all kinds of a stigma and false narratives. But beyond that, they've been complicit in reproducing the official narratives of the drug trade that have devastated our country for decades, including, of course, the defense of anti-drug policy that pushed the militarization into Mexico, and that so far has caused over 400,000 killings and over 100,000 forced disappearances. And then as the show came about with all this Mexican dimension, it is being consumed in Mexico as almost as if it were a documentary. And what I believe that is the saddest aspect of all this is not that we couldn't understand because it was in a different language, but that was in the actual language that we all spoke, that was said in front of our eyes, and repeated, and that was celebrated as truth or worse, some form of critical take on the drug trade. At some point, a narrator in one of the episodes says that drug traffickers are like cockroaches that should be burned or stepped on or exterminated. And as the voice is saying this, the camera moves around a rural area in the north of Mexico where peasant families are producing marijuana, and they're literally burned by military forces. Nameless brown faces, right, killed on screen, while this DEA agent makes an appeal to call them cockroaches, right? The very language of fascism, right? The language that has been reproduced in so many contexts, right? So while I celebrate, of course, the gesture of resistance because of the question of translation, right? What is happening in a show like Narcos is the work of translation, right? That allows for the correct dissemination of a message that is not hidden, that is actually openly exposed, that is causing or naming perhaps the destruction, and that we are all consuming as entertainment.
Yeah. Those are both great examples, and you got ahead of me because I was going to ask about these shows, right? And so the media representation and then your own work, right? And that juxtaposition. And this leads me to another question. So how do you work and fight against structural inequalities and injustices, which Dr. Green talked about earlier, when it's part of the system itself, right? And not only is it, we can point to different actors and institutions that reproduce these inequalities, but we're also complicit in it, right? I'm from Chile, from South America, right? So how are we complicit in our own communities? How do we see this being reproduced? So how do you fight inequality when it's ingrained in the system that we live in?
Professor.
What tips?
It was your turn to get the difficult question.
I'm keeping score, by the way. It's 2-1. Yeah, well, I think it has a lot to do with one's own commitments, right? And that also can mean choosing your venue very carefully. I'll give you an example from my own life, which is there was a time in the mid 2010s when Peter King, I don't know if people remember him, he was the representative from Long Island, and he had these congressional hearings about radicalization in the Muslim community, right? And it was just like horrible, and it was equivalent of red baiting, and it was just all like it was demoralizing to the community, fear mongering of the worst sort, politicking of the cheapest variety, all of that stuff, right? And it was very much like something that you would have seen in the 1950s. And I was thinking about this at the time. And there's that great essay about paranoia in American politics. I'm forgetting the Richard Hofstadter's essay, "The Paranoid in American Politics." Somebody remind me. Do I have the title right? Anyways, he has this fabulous essay about the paranoid style. It's the paranoid style in American politics is what it's called. And it's very much about how the right wing uses this sort of paranoia much more effectively than the left wing. And it was around the Red Scare that he's writing about. Right? And so I was thinking about this essay in particular at the time that these hearings were going on. And then I get a request from the New York Times asking me if I would write an opinion piece about the hearings. So, and they wanted it, of course, like it was maybe 11 a.m. and they wanted it by like 4 p.m. or something like that too, right? So I jump on my bike and ride home, right? And because I'd already been thinking about this, I pull out this like thing about, and looking at this historical comparison, and then I file with them. And then they write back the next day and they're like, okay, that was great, but how are you feeling about this? Right? Like they didn't want analysis from the minority. They wanted just emotion. That's at least how I read it, right? And that strikes me as problematic, right? And that's where venue starts to matter a lot. So I find, I tend to write more for smaller left-wing. I mean, the Guardian might be global. I get a lot of global hits when I write those pieces, and global hate mail too, which is nice. But it's still in the U.S. it's a smaller outfit, and it's on the left. Same with The Nation. I write a lot for The Nation, and I don't have to make an argument there for the kinds of values that I'm committed to. And so I think that's a first step, is like, knowing what where you are and what they expect from you, and when possible, try to push. So I just dropped that piece. Like I wasn't going to do that for them. And so, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, as somebody from the border, I keep having this dual paranoid, perhaps, take on media representations and questions about the politics of representation that complicate my own choices as a citizen, as a journalist. And I can give you just a quick story about that. When in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton lost with perhaps a lesser margin of Hispanic voters. I remember the media consistently talking about the betrayal of the Hispanic community, right? That did not support Hillary Clinton's campaign the same way they had for Barack Obama. The first thing that friends of mine who rally the Latino vote, friends of mine who rally the Latino vote, who work with registering Latino voters, tell me is that it's strange to them still today that in this country there's an assumed block, right, of voters that should all be liberal before being human beings, right? And for a lot of the media representation of Latino voters, we are not people, we're just Latino liberals that somehow should support the liberal cause because they're the ones protecting migrants or supposedly doing so. And that for me brings all kinds of questions that go back to my own life, right? The fact, for example, that many of my uncles on the U.S. side of the border supported Donald Trump, right? Uncles that had come to the U.S. as undocumented migrants who found that liberal politics from the Democratic Party were untenable. And that list of complications goes on and on. Myself, when I was about to vote, of course, I was not going to vote for the man who called Mexicans rapists and criminals in the first day of his campaign. But I definitely had a problem with the Clintonite era neoliberal policies that, for example, among many other legacies, build the first segments of the U.S.-Mexico wall, right? Something that gets lost in the Trump years because of all of his aggressive discourse. But it was, in fact, Bill Clinton who started building the wall in places like Tijuana, for example. I don't know if you've ever seen that, those the steel bars that separate Tijuana and San Diego. Those, by the way, were brought from Desert Storm, right? From a different set of war interventionist era to poetically divide the U.S.-Mexico border. And then if you add to this, of course, that Barack Obama was, and I think it still is, the largest deportator of migrants in the history of this country, that of course complicates the picture, along with the fact that Hillary Clinton had a very aggressive, extractive policy for Latin America of the land dispossession and taking over energy for transnational companies. So as this was happening, right, I had a very neurotic moment at the booth, right, at the moment of voting, and I keep thinking that in many ways that's the welcoming aspect of democracy, right? That we get to consider these things, and I as a migrant citizen get to contribute to this discussion, but also to the question of just how exactly we are supposed to respond in a system that is not only imperfect, but that as it does good things, it does horrible things simultaneously, right? And that as a U.S. citizen, I would favor the presidency of Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, but as a Mexican citizen, I fear it. Mm-hmm. And so there is that potential displacement of, I think, of a lot of these communities, right, of the Latino communities in this country that undergo that same dilemma, right, that have different takes on what is the politics surrounding them. And yet we are long from perceiving critically who they are and who they would be voting for if they could do so in a freer way.
Yeah, thank you. You both bring up great points about, not only discourse and narrative analysis, but commitment. Like, what do we actually do, praxis?
Sure.
So we only have 5 more minutes. I also wish you all could stay all week for this great conversation. Briefly, so we have many students present here and joining us virtually. Some are just starting off their academic journeys, others are getting ready to graduate, but they're all making decisions about majors, about grad school, internships, or about work in this complex world that needs their talents. They need your talents. So what words of advice or what insight or let's say words of inspiration would you like to give to our students, to our Jaguars who are here in the audience?
Thank you. Nicely done. As a student that migrated in the 90s, right, speaking little English and having difficulty to translate the biology classes in my first semester, I found that the U.S. university setting, it's very generous in opportunity, and even as somebody who did not have the privilege of a Pell Grant or financial aid, I was able to thrive in a way that perhaps a Mexican institution wouldn't have done for me. So for that, I'm extremely grateful of the openness of the public institutions in the U.S. And in many ways, that's why I feel so privileged and honored to work in one, as in this one, right? The City University of New York. So I believe that public institutions in general are places of extreme opportunity, of extreme diversity, where different life stories are told and where the experiences of each other teach us ways to improve ourselves and to aspire to different realms of social mobility. So the one thing that perhaps defined my story was that at the same time as I took advantage of those opportunities, I just pushed myself to keep working in every single one of the options that were given to me in my media studies department, right? I was at the local radio station, I was doing TV, I was in the local newspaper, and that excess of opportunity and that hunger that I believe most of us have when we're young was welcomed and celebrated. I do believe it's a much more difficult arena for finding jobs, especially in media nowadays. But as Mustafa was saying, we are also in the era of extreme democratization, right? So I believe that as those doors are closing in the traditional press, there are many ways to reopen them in the virtual world, and that is definitely one of the biggest advantages. But above all, I do believe that the best thing that I ever did was just to approach a professor, ask questions, tell them what is it that I wanted to do, and finding that each one of them had a door to open for me, a book to read, a job opportunity that changed my life dramatically. And so I believe that for that respect, I wanted to spend my life in a university because I felt like my life was in constant transformation, and I believe still is because of public universities.
We're all taking notes. That's great. Mustafa, how about you?
You know, I would say that, follow your commitments. That the pursuit of truth through, in my case, writing or whatever it is, in terms of alleviating human suffering, is noble, and you can do it, and you should do it just because we're here on Earth. And sometimes it shows up in ways that can surprise you. We don't do it for the recognition. I think we do it because we should do it. But sometimes you're surprised by what happens. I can give you an example. So, one of the stories that I wrote about in How Does It Feel to Be a Problem is the story of Rasha. And Rasha and her family had come from Syria. This is a long time ago now, and they had applied for asylum. And now we all know how long it takes to get an asylum claim heard. And then when 9/11 happened, because they were in this precarious gray zone of a situation, they get picked up by the authorities, right? Because the authorities have this idea that they're going to prioritize people who come from Muslim countries. And so eventually, Rasha and her family spend about 3 months in immigration detention. They basically have just disappeared from the face of the planet. Her friends, and she's lived here in the United States at that point about 15 years, and she's about 18, 19 years old. And so her friends see that she's gone and her sister's gone, and they start advocating, looking for her, whatever. They eventually find a lawyer who helps them. The U.S. government doesn't make it easy because they're not even releasing the names of people that they've arrested at that point and all that sort of stuff. Eventually, though, they get the assistance that they need, and eventually they're actually let go, right? But it was a very traumatic thing, not just for her, but for her whole entire family. But they never talked about it after they were released. We can understand why. It's a really difficult thing for any family to go through. But Rasha was generous enough to share her story with me, and so then I wrote about it in the book. And then before the book came out, a little excerpt from the book was published in New York Magazine as a kind of teaser, right? They do that with books. And so New York Magazine said that they wanted to take from Rasha's chapter, and then they asked me if Rasha would sit with a photographer with her family. I said, oh, I don't think so, but I'll ask her. And so then her family, she came back to me and she said, no, I won't do it with my family. And then I told them, and then they said, well, what about just with her and her friends? Because there are two friends that are also in the story. So to my surprise, she said, sure. And so then she met with this photographer and all of that sort of stuff. And it was, for her, it was fun because she got a professional photographer paying attention to her and her friends and all that stuff. And then the issue was about to come out. And so, like 2 a.m., whatever was when it dropped like online and all that sort of stuff. So I email her and I go to sleep that it's going to be out tomorrow, whatever. And then I go to sleep. And then I wake up and then I get an email immediately from her, and she says, I know, everybody's stopping me on the street saying, do you know you're a New York Magazine? And then in all caps, as if I didn't know, right? Anyway, at that point, she was working for a judge. She was doing like paralegaling kind of work, right? And so she worked for this, it was a big law firm, actually. It wasn't a judge, it was just a big law firm. She was working for this big law firm. And the partners are like gods in the law firm. And so you never see the partners. You just, if you're this lowly paralegal, she's like below paralegal level, right? And she goes to work that day, and then she gets called in, and she's like, yes, and one of the partners wants to talk to her. And this is like an amazing thing. It's like being a student and ask the president of the university saying, I want to talk to you. So she goes and she goes into his office, and it's all like, cherry wood and beautiful, whatever. And then he has the magazine on his desk. And he says to her, this is you? And she says, yes. And he said, this happened to you and your family? She said, yes. And he said, this shouldn't happen, not in this country. And he said, I know a federal judge. I'm going to call him up right now. I'm going to tell him that he has to read this and know what's going on. And then the way she told me it is she said that at that moment, all that pressure from that experience just like left her body. Because somebody in a position of importance, of power, was recognizing the wrong that had happened to her. And she was so thankful to me for having facilitated that. And I had no idea that was ever going to happen. And it was just like, it was an extra gift, So those are the kinds of things that can happen from this kind of work.
Thank you. Pursuit of truth to alleviate human suffering. What great words to end this with. So this concludes our conversation, but not the event. So I'll turn it over to Novi Pagon. Thank you both so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I wish we could be here for a much longer period of time. Of course, help all my students were taking notes. So we have time for a little bit of time for questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please step up to the microphone, and we'll just take them in order.
High. Yeah, I have a question. I'm Rashida Muhammad. I'm a professor here. I teach writing. I'm a writer, but we traffic in a language, English, which disenfranchises everyone all the time. How do you navigate this language in your work, for your work? When, like it's talked about earlier, some of the illegal aliens. A lot of times, and I have to say, English, even though it's my language, until I studied at the University of London, and they told me I was American. And American teacher, you teach American. Okay, I said, I'm not gonna argue with the whole country. Okay. But even English is sexist.
Sure.
Men are in everything, all parts of the language. How do you deal with this thing? I was talking to my grandson today. I said, what man you know has a period? What is menstruation? This language is sexist, racist, and how do we navigate it as writing teachers, as writers, so that we're not a part of the system that continues to disenfranchise?
That's an extraordinary question. Well, should I? Well, I appreciate the question. Thank you so much. I work with language, and in many ways, that's what's been my entertaining my agenda, my research agenda in the last perhaps 10 years. One thing that first and by listening to you, I remember immediately is when the ceremony when I became a U.S. citizen, the judge welcomed me to America, right? I had been to the U.S. since 1999, but also I believed that I was already in America, right? I mean, in the sense that the entire continent, at least as I was educated, is called America, and I was an American, right? And there's a long debate in Latin American literature and politics about being American, right? Americanos, right? And so at that moment, I recalled, of course, that I am always immersed in conflict and dispute when I speak. Language is a place of struggle and battle, right? And war in many ways, as Michel Foucault taught us. It's also the place of encounters, of friendship, of alliance. So it's both, right? And I believe as a writer, as an intellectual, I must make the space of conflict entertain the space of reconciliation, right? Find what is not conflict and make it live, give it space, right? And that begins in the power of naming things, right? And perhaps that is why my previous book, right, Drug Cartels Do Not Exist, was in many ways aimed at reclaiming that critical language and relabeling my own reality for those purposes. But I also believe that it's just an ongoing process that doesn't end, right? That we must always keep guard at language, the way we speak, and language, of course, that ends up being the epistemic grounding for public policy, for violence, for real violence, not just symbolic violence, that is also, of course, important violence, but that founds our own perception of reality. And so I believe that every time we speak, as Mustafa was saying, we need to honor the commitment, not only to be truthful, but to also highlight and denounce the wrong, the untrustworthy, the betraying of language, right? That happens in our daily speaking. And yes, I begin with reclaiming American for myself since I was in Mexico, but also in the ongoing process of disputing my own, the naming of my own reality. Sure.
I think that unfortunately, it's not only English. It's true for maybe almost all the languages.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think, though, there is a way with a lot of sort of, play and almost guerrilla action in language, you can shift people's sensibilities. And you see that, I think, happening a lot in literature these days. You see a lot of different language mixtures coming in. You see a lot of, in popular media, you might see even extended scenes that aren't translated or not even subtitled, all of that
Beautiful
stuff.
Spanglish.
You see that, definitely. So I think a lot of that is really important, but I think what you don't see as much, and what we should, as scholars, be more involved in, is actually unearthing the history of the language itself and the violence that's behind the language itself, right? And so as journalists, it's even harder because usually there's a style sheet, and so you have to adapt to the style sheet, at least in print. But I think that there is a way of thinking through this very, very important question. And if we all did it, then maybe, language is a contract between speakers. So if we all decide that we're going to speak differently, then the language will change as soon as that. So.
Good evening. I'm Sandra Finley, and I'm president and CEO of League of Black Women. So glad to be here and really privileged, and thanking Dr. Coffey for inviting me to hear this conversation. The part of language really resonated with me when you talked about not wanting to support the identification of a people as illegal aliens anymore, and what you personally did about it. That resonated. What I want to know, as you are both representatives of an industry that communicates, how to get the industry that you're part of to stop calling my people people of color. Now, we have said we're Black people. We have told the world we're Black people. The world knows we're Black people, but somehow or another, it seems to be fashionable now to kind of liquefy and dilute the identity of my people. And while we complain about it and say we don't like it, I really want to know what is the specific Achilles heel that will stop it in its tracks, because it's starting to cost us now. The asset of our identity is multi-generational and wealthy. And the easiest way to get people to give up something you can't beat is to convince them that it's not worth anything. So the industry, the press, has just fallen in love with this people of color thing. And I'd like to know what you think about how to tell it to stop this stuff. Y'all know what I meant to say. Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question, and it's an important point. I think that we shouldn't underestimate the conservativeness of the media itself. It moves slowly, and it's with trepidation as with shifts in language and in values. Though they always want to portray themselves as, or I'm generalizing, but there is this sense that the media will be a vanguard. But they're often afraid of change because they wait for, the gray lady to do it, or someone first, right? Namely something like the New York Times or some establishment to do it. So one way, I think this is a sort of pragmatic question, a practical question that you're, I think, posing on one level. And I think as a practical solution is, a lot of communities actually go and they sit with editorial boards and they say, this is my issue. I don't like how this is being represented. What do you say about this? And the more that those kinds of conversations can be had around newsrooms around the country, the more chance you have of that issue being taken up by the the people who are the decision makers in the news business. So that's one suggestion.
Well, I would add to that, and I completely agree with Mustafa, that the phenomenon with language, it's always inscribed in hegemony, right? In dominant narratives that traverse not just a field, but an entire society. And in the case of the comment that I was making about illegal aliens, that concept had its origins in official power structures that were legitimized by the media. So the media was not entirely responsible for the first enunciation of it, but rather they were complicit in an hegemonic narrative that for them was not only logical, but brought them closer to official power, right? It was who had the power to name an entire group of people illegals, right? And so that the moment of naming, it's really where I believe it's our key conundrum, right? It's the moment where we need to be alert and dispute it, right? And so it is unfortunately a process that does not end with replacing one term with another, but rather that historically moves around us and diachronically keeps shifting. And so it happens now that in the Latino community, for example, the concept of Latino seems to be more embracing, but for somebody like me who believes to be somehow a Mexican citizen temporarily relocated in New York for the last 20 years, has its own limitations. So in the end, I believe that, as Mustafa was saying, it comes down to a collective dispute of the naming itself. In the moment where we are politicized enough collectively to inscribe ourselves at the moment of that power inscription, whether it is in the media newsroom with the editors, or whether it is in a congressional caucus, or in a presidential cabinet. But even accessing those places of naming is in itself useless if there is not first a collective critical reflection on the naming itself, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that it's not just the moment where we collectively denounce something, but whether once we are able to find ourselves in that moment of description, that we have thought about enough, what is it that we want to be said, that will for some time suffice. And I think that's the real challenge, right? So in the end, it's about us thinking for ourselves collectively. And that is, of course, a very difficult thing to do, because it will keep shifting. And there may be a moment that what we decided will be deemed wrong, right, or equivocal, as it has been for the Hispanic community. So we have to accept that this naming process will keep shifting and perhaps will not include us anymore, right? And so, as I said, I think this is a challenge that we forever be reconstructed, reified, and that perhaps our best way to do it is to keep teaching ourselves to think critically, creatively about it.
We have time for maybe two more questions.
Some I can ask you. You are some chosen ones. Very good. I was just reflecting on how President Obama had said when he spoke in South Africa, how the few at the very top that control most of the world. Likewise, with the media, you got very few that controls what comes out of the media. So you as writers and so forth, I think when you said give the truth in small packages or something like that, you can say a whole lot in a few words. But how do you address that situation where you have just a few controlling the media? And we know a former president had a wing of media that he controlled.
Well, I think we sort of talked a little bit about the potentialities, the possibilities of a more democratic media landscape that exists there today. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity in that. It doesn't cost very much to create a website, and you can actually, if you have really honest to good content on a website, you don't have to be somebody who is connected to the big players to suddenly become an important figure in today's media landscape. And there are plenty of examples from political pundits, from the left to the right, who write about politics. Maybe this is the opinion side of things coming through. But then there's also, like I was mentioning, Documented earlier, which is essentially just a website. They don't have anything beyond a website as a way of disseminating their news gathering. And even, nobody had heard of Mark Zuckerberg how many years ago. There are opportunities, I think, that weren't there before. Before, you needed a lot of capital. You needed to have the backing of a certain position and editorial and all of that stuff. And you don't need that anymore. What you do really need is, I think, something to say. And there's so much out there that doesn't have actually a lot to say. That's different or enlightening and not just to say, but also the research that would go behind it, right, in order to say something substantial and needed. And then, what you find is that then pretty soon they'll start knocking on your door and they'll try to buy you out. That's actually, I think, happens a lot too. So I think that I agree with you that in the media landscape is dominated by the big corporate players. But for example, I've been on Democracy Now! A handful of times, which is a very reputable, wide distributed news show.
Maybe the only one.
I mean, look at The Intercept. I mean, sure, they had a benefactor, but again, it was like there's more. It's a bigger community than it used to be. And with that comes opportunity. And of course, capitalism is predatory by nature, right? And so with any success, you're going to be, the vultures are going to come, I think, right? But you don't have to, let them eat you. So I'm going to end on that.
All right. Without entirely disagreeing with Mustafa, I would add that the problem with the media, whether it is the big enterprise, the big corporate companies, or the appearance, the freer alternative digital outlets, is the fact that we keep losing the commons, right? We keep losing the public, the truly public space, unregulated public space, unregulated from corporate and private interest. And so this is where I would say that the free creativity of perhaps a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk is not only not the solution, but one of the truest potential dangers, right? We know for a fact now that both Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are true threats to democracy, right? And they have created virtual places where violence is extreme and brings discourse to disgusting levels, right? And so in this question of regulating the social media landscape, I am completely in favor for the return of the public power to democratize and to open and truly make those spaces public. And I think that would begin with freeing internet access, making it entirely public, push corporate oligopolies to diversify, to let go, right, of this master companies that own billion papers and news networks, and to keep pushing for a public discussion in the public arena, whether it is in Congress, in government, or in a public university setting, to accompany the opening of these environments, right? So I distrust completely the force and creativity of a single individual, right? But I do believe that collectively we can correct our tendency to fascism and violence.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. Yes. You've given us much to think about, much to discuss. As the end of this week and next week, we'll be discussing that. Thank you so much, Mustafa, Bayoumi, Oswaldo, Zavala, and thank you, Jelena Radovic-Fanta, for moderating. Thank you all for being here. Before I close the program, I want to thank our production team from DLMD for their work tonight. They're sort of the man behind the curtain. They're not in here. They're controlling from elsewhere. So thank you all for coming. That concludes our program. If you've entered the raffle, please stick around. We'll do that off broadcast. And we have a few books to give away. So thank you all. Have a good evening and get home safely.
Of course, yes, sure.
Oh, sure. Just sign in or? Okay. Sure.